Good morning and welcome to Rising. We have a great show for you today. As always, the dream team is back. I'm Amber Duke, joined by Niall Standage.
Great to see you, Amber. It's been a few weeks since we got to do this, and I always enjoy our conversations and debates.
Me too. It's nice to see you.
For sure. Now, ahead this morning on Rising, Alligator Alcatraz, the Trump administration's Everglades-based immigration detention facility, may soon be closing. We'll tell you why.
Plus, the president is floating a midterm convention next year, and the Democrats may be considering it too. What it means for the midterms.
And former Vice President Kamala Harris will no longer be under Secret Service protection after President Trump revoked it just this morning.
But first, we're still learning more details about the tragic, deadly shooting Wednesday at a Minneapolis Catholic school and church.
As police look for a motive, they found the suspected shooter's handwritten journal, much of which was encrypted in a kind of homemade code that included Russian script and English words. Now, according to the New York Post's description of that journal, the suspected shooter, who identified as a trans woman, expressed regret that they were trans, writing, quote, "I am tired of being trans. I wish I never brainwashed myself." And continuing on, "I regret being trans. I wish I was a girl. I just know I cannot achieve that body with the technology we have today. I also can't afford that."
FBI Director Kash Patel also posting this about the suspect on X. "Our teams have gathered information and evidence demonstrating this was an act of domestic terrorism motivated by a hate-filled ideology." Patel continued, saying, "Subject left multiple anti-Catholic, anti-religious references both in his manifesto and written on his firearms. Subject expressed hatred and violence toward Jewish people, writing 'Israel must fall, free Palestine,' and using explicit language related to the Holocaust. He wrote an explicit call for violence against President Trump on a firearm magazine. The FBI investigation is still ongoing. We will employ all of our counter-terror tools to ensure this is fully investigated and deterred." In the meantime, the suspect's apparent anti-Catholic rhetoric has sparked a debate in some circles about whether the trans community is anti-Christian, with Fox and Friends host Rachel Campos-Duffy saying it may be part of a larger trend of violence against Christians.
The last big school shooting we remember, there's been others, the last one with a lot of attention, was at a Christian school. This is a Catholic school. What happened this summer in Syria in the middle of Mass, June, at a Greek Orthodox church, right in the middle of Mass. Yes, we need to think about these things happening here. Christians are the most persecuted religion in the universe right now in the world. So that's definitely a potential motive.
Campos-Duffy also suggested in that segment that HHS Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. look into the connection between SSRIs, or more commonly known as antidepressant medication, and suicide and homicide. Kennedy was asked about it the next day on Fox and Friends and said this.
We're launching studies on the potential contribution of some of the SSRI drugs and some of the other psychiatric drugs that might be contributing to violence. Many of them on there have black box warnings that warn of suicidal ideation and homicidal ideation. So we can't exclude those as a culprit.
That response from Kennedy did not sit well with Minnesota Senator Tina Smith, who blasted Kennedy on X, writing, "I dare you to go to Annunciation School and tell our grieving community, in effect, guns don't kill kids, antidepressants do. Just shut up. Stop peddling bleep. You should be fired." A lot to get to, Amber, and we've only about 5 minutes to get to it, so I suspect we won't get to everything, but a lot of hot button issues here. What's your view?
Yeah, wow.
Of it all.
Yeah, look, there's a lot to talk about. Rachel Campos-Duffy, I do think, makes an important point, and I'm actually going to broaden out what she said, because what we've traditionally seen in school shootings in the United States is that there are some common linkages between the shooters and the targets that they choose. SSRI use is one of those often common linkages between the school shooters, although not every single one, of course. Another one is marijuana use, poor relationship with their parents, usually some kind of loneliness or isolation, and usually their targets are public schools. It's actually pretty rare for private schools and Christian schools in particular to be the target of a school shooting, except the 3 most deadly school shootings that we have seen in the past few years have all been at Christian schools. The Wisconsin shooting at Abundant Life, the Nashville shooting at the private Christian kids school, and then of course most recently on Wednesday at Annunciation, which is an interesting trend and obviously raises a lot of questions as to why that is. Why has the focus turned from public schools, typically places that the shooter themselves attended, instead to private Christian academies?
Well, I mean, it is the case that those attacks were on Christian schools. Now, it is also the case that there have been an enormous increase in school shootings generally in recent years. There's actually now a database, the K-12 School Shooting Project, I believe, that tracks these and shows how much they have increased. And there have been 2 particular steps up in recent times. It had been around 50 to 60 shootings of some kind, incidents with firearms at schools, up until about 2017, 2018, when it doubled. And then it around the 2021 time doubled again. So now we're up to, 300 incidents, for example, last year. I think in that context, either targeting of Christian schools or trans involvement is pretty minuscule. Now, is there enmity toward Christian schools? I mean, presumably there is on the part of the people who are shooting at them. Whether that represents a widespread problem, I think, is a different question. I also, this is not related to Campos Duffy, but I was in the White House press briefing yesterday when someone, not your correspondent at the Daily Caller, but someone else, suggested that a new form of domestic terrorism should be defined to include people subscribing to trans ideology, which I find both an offensive suggestion and one not grounded in any kind of reality at all. There has been studies done on the number of instances where there have been trans perpetrators of shootings, and according to the Gun Violence Project, it amounted to 1 shooting in every 880 over the past decade. And it is also worth noting that trans people, in fact, are disproportionately likely to be the victims of various kinds of attacks, including assault and things like that. So I'm very skeptical of anything that blames trans people. I also think there is a tendency on both sides, and I would acknowledge this, to suggest that the beliefs of people who carry out shootings are ideologically neater than they are. Oftentimes, I think they're people who are obviously very seriously disturbed and whose beliefs are often just sort of incoherent hatreds.
I do agree with that last point. One of the examples of that was the Buffalo shooter. A lot of people were trying to neatly fit him into some partisan box, but he simultaneously described himself as a white nationalist, but also a left-wing eco-fascist, right? Like, right. Their views are very rarely coherent, right. Because there's some kind of, obviously, mental problem going on there. I think the reason why people are focused on the trans identity is because of the targeting of the Catholic school, as well as with the fact that this person apparently expressed a desire to detransition. And we also know that trans people have higher rates of mental illness, which could be a predicting factor for either propensity to violence or some kind of event in their life, like something to themselves, self-harm.
Yeah, I don't really dispute that, but you mentioned the Nashville Christian school that was attacked, and the so-called manifesto there, which I reminded myself of this morning going through it, is really this selection of writings that are, the writings of an obviously disturbed person talking about things like autism that they had been diagnosed with, then at other times resenting friends who they felt had forsaken them for the friends' romantic partners, just this sort of litany of grievances, really. And I think it can be too easily put in oversimplistic boxes.
I wish we had 30 minutes for this one, Niall, but unfortunately we've got to move on.
We do indeed. Both parties are preparing for a crucial midterm election. Democrats and Republicans planning unusual midterm events. We'll talk about that after a quick break.
Well, it's still over a year until the major midterm elections, but both parties are already planning big events around it. President Trump this week hinting at an RNC convention before the 2026 midterms. Posting on Truth Social, touting the Republican Party's success, the president also saying this. In that light, I am thinking of recommending a national convention to the Republican Party just prior to the midterms. It has never been done before. Stay tuned.
Democrats are also making plans of their own. The Democratic National Committee already confirming its idea for a large gathering next year. The DNC releasing this statement. Americans everywhere are fired up and ready to fight back against Trump's reckless policies, including his budget betrayal that cuts healthcare and food assistance for millions of people.
Holding national conventions around midterms is fairly unheard of. Parties generally wait until presidential elections to hold these major events, but Republicans are hoping to hold on to control of the House and the Senate and are actually looking forward to maybe even expanding the margin in the House.
Historically, midterms are not a very fertile ground for the party that holds the White House. However, there has been a redistricting battle in several red and blue states. Texas being the first to sign a new congressional map, which will likely create 5 extra seats for the GOP. Well, obviously in this one, Amber, it's not like there's a Liberal and Democratic position, or Liberal and Republican position, I should say, given that they're both proposing these ideas. I've mixed feelings. I like covering conventions, so I wouldn't mind an extra couple of them for the midterms. From the party perspective, I'm not too sure of the merits of it. I mean, you're having a national event without a national candidate for a start, which seems questionable. And then the other part of it is conventions are very costly to put on. I was looking up the figures for last time around, and the Democrats raised about 95 million, the Republicans 85 million. For their respective conventions in Chicago and Milwaukee, I think
that's right.
The Republicans were. So whether they really would get the bang for the buck on a midterm convention seems questionable.
I can't imagine the donors are too thrilled to hear about this, right?
So. Right?
Okay, so we're trying to launch this historic midterm effort to keep the House and the Senate and have the party trifecta. And now you're telling us we have to donate more so that you can have a convention. Although I do think it probably makes more sense for the Republican Party only because they have this massive figure in Trump where his endorsements, his just being sort of the leader of the Republican Party, even when he's not on the ballot, does help to boost Republican electoral chances, both on just the general ballot and individual candidates. So maybe the thinking is, well, if I go up there and I tell everyone, hey, if you like what I'm doing or you like this policy, you have to vote for these down ballot people so that I can continue working on my agenda. I don't see the Democrats having a similar setup there where they're able to sort of rally from one individual or even just a handful.
Right. That is a fair point that the Democrats do not have that individual. I think they are looking at it for a different purpose, really, which is the idea that they could give rising stars or potential 2028 candidates a moment in the spotlight, or at least try and up the party morale and get them kind of coalescing around a few goals, though it's not at this point clear exactly what those goals would be. It is true that national conventions have sometimes boosted people who are not either the presidential or vice presidential candidate. Obama is perhaps the most famous example. In 2004, when John Kerry was the Democratic nominee, Obama's speech there really launched him as a national figure. So for that purpose, it might help Democrats. On the Republican side, I take your point about Trump, although I suppose the flip side of that is there a political risk to him if he identifies himself in a super prominent way with the midterm campaign and it doesn't go well for Republicans?
Yeah, that's definitely the risk, of course. I think one of the things Republicans are looking at, just when I talk to consultants and analysts, is that they feel the approval rating is higher than it was during his first term at the same time. The Republican Party's approval rating far outpaces the Democrats, so they feel fairly confident. But then, of course, you have to throw in where's the economy going to be ahead of the midterms. That's probably the single most important factor. One other thing that we also saw, which could be a preview for the upcoming DNC midterm convention, was they just had their summer annual meeting. And from the conservative Republican perspective, I have to say, if I were JD Vance, I would be licking my chops because it seemed like they doubled down on a lot of the policies that have been unpopular, particularly in the November election. I mean, they started with the land acknowledgement right. They're talking about not cooperating with ICE. They're talking about suing the Trump administration for trying to prevent kids from getting on puberty blockers. I just thought the whole thing seemed a little wacky.
I think that, first of all, the land acknowledgement, myself and Robbie discussed that earlier this week. I understand why it irks people. It doesn't particularly irk me. I wouldn't demand that they do it either. It just passes by and it creates a kind of a little bit of a stir, mostly in, I think, conservative media. I think that there is a merit to Democrats having a convention if they can focus it more on economic issues. So to that point, I do, take your broader point about things like the puberty blockers and all of that. We have talked several times about trans people in sport, trans teens in sport in particular, which seems a bad issue for Democrats in general if they continue with a position that is out of step with the majority of the public. But if they could actually get more prominent voices or more effective voices championing their agenda, and if they could get a clearer and more consistent sense of what that agenda is, I think it could pay off.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think the problem for them will be even more specific than the developing the agenda is which direction are they going? Because right now there's sort of two wings of the Democratic Party as I see it. There's the sort of progressive, very supportive of the Palestinian cause, really interested in a more democratic socialist economic policy. Let's just call it the Mamdani wing for simplicity's sake. And then there's the establishment. And it's difficult because the progressive wing has some baggage with social issues, potentially, cultural issues, but the establishment wing has problems with foreign policy and economics. So, it's going to be hard for them, I think, to marry those two visions.
No, there are genuine divides there for sure. And, my views on the Palestinian issue are pretty well known, I think, at this stage. I think that the base of the party is, as in the voters for Democrats, are plainly wanting a more assertively pro-Palestinian position on that topic. But then, the establishment of the Democratic Party has fared so badly across a whole range of issues that I think is part of the reason why the Mamdani type people are getting more energy, at least.
Yeah, I think that's right, especially among young people, and that's consistent with the Republican Party too on the Israel-Palestine issue. Yeah,
the big generational gap there. Coming up, President Trump has revoked Kamala Harris's Secret Service protection. Don't go anywhere.
New this morning, President Trump has revoked former Vice President Kamala Harris's Secret Service detail.
Vice presidents typically get 6 months of protection after they leave office. Harris's had been set to expire in July, but former President Biden extended it before he left office.
Trump canceled this extension, writing in a Thursday memorandum obtained by CNN, quote, "You are hereby authorized to discontinue any security-related procedures previously authorized by executive memorandum, beyond those required by law for the individual, effective September 1st, 2025, former Vice President Kamala D. Harris."
Harris told CNN, quote, "The Vice President is grateful to the United States Secret Service for their professionalism, dedication, and unwavering commitment to safety." Since Harris lives in Los Angeles, she potentially could get protection from the city's police. LA Mayor Karen Bass told CNN, quote, "This is another act of revenge following a long list of political retaliation in the form of firings, the revoking of security clearances, and more. This puts the former Vice President in danger, and I look forward to working with the governor to make sure Vice President Harris is safe in Los Angeles." Well, I have a partisan point to make and a non-partisan point to make.
Okay,
so I'll start with the gentle non-partisan point. I would prefer more rather than fewer political figures in this country to have Secret Service protection. And I think that there is, in fact, not enough protection of high-profile figures. I think that former vice presidents should have it for longer than 6 months. And I think that of people with whom I fervently disagree, like Dick Cheney, as much as I think of it as for people like Kamala Harris. So that's my overall view of it all. Because I think that people who are in danger because of service they have rendered to the country should be protected from the physical dangers that are therefore incurred. Now, in relation to Trump and Harris, I think I would view this through the context of his revocation, which Karen Bass mentioned, of security clearances for other people who he dislikes, including John Bolton, who, I don't have much in common with, and including the removal of security clearances, which is, of course, a different issue from Secret Service details. Notable that this comes as Harris is shortly to embark on this nationwide book tour.
Yeah, I think what is really going to be the tell here is if we're able to see what the undisclosed reason for the Biden extension was. That will be able to tell us whether this is indeed political retaliation or if this was extended for some reason other than safety and security. Maybe the intelligence wasn't as strong as Biden said that it was, and so Trump's revoking it to save taxpayer money and reverting back to the normal 6-month vice presidential protection period. We have no way of knowing that unless that information is declassified.
That's true if you think, if you take the view people should only have Secret Service protection if there is a specific threat, then what you say is true. My argument would be whether it's Kamala Harris or George W. Bush or anyone else, people who have reached a certain level of national political prominence have, unfortunately, people who want to do them harm. And I know you could potentially extend that to everybody and say, every single member of the House of Representatives should have Secret Service protection or something. And then you would get into an unwieldy situation. But presidents, vice presidents, I would have no problem at all with them having lifetime Secret Service protection.
It's unfortunate we don't have time to get into the John Bolton and security clearance issue, but I did want to make one final point before we go, which is that I do think Democrats are going to get themselves into a pretzel here, trying to say that Trump is doing political retaliation and that he wants Kamala Harris wants some harm to come to her, because a lot of Democrats voted to get rid of Trump's Secret Service detail, both before and after the assassination attempt on his life.
Yeah, and I wouldn't support that either. Right. I would have lifetime Secret Service protection for him too.
All right, up next, earlier this week, President Trump said he'll allow 600,000 Chinese students to attend U.S. universities, but a new proposed rule from the administration would put a cap on how long they get to stay. More on that next. Trump administration is looking to put a limit on the amount of time that foreign students can study in the U.S. The Department of Homeland Security is proposing a rule that it says will allow for proper vetting of certain visa holders and prevent visa abuse. The DHS says, quote, "For too long, past administrations have allowed foreign students and other visa holders to remain in the U.S. virtually indefinitely, posing safety risks, costing untold amount of taxpayer dollars, and disadvantaging U.S. citizens. This new proposed rule would end that abuse once and for all by limiting the amount of time certain visa holders are allowed to remain in the U.S., easing the burden on the federal government to properly oversee foreign students and their history."
Under this new rule, foreign students would be allowed to stay no longer than 4 years. That's as opposed to the current duration of status system, where they can stay for as long as they are enrolled as a full-time student. The non-profit group, President's Alliance on Higher Education and Immigration, spoke out against the proposal. It says, quote, "This proposed rule sends a message to talented individuals from around the world that their contributions are not valued in the United States. This is not only detrimental to international students, it also weakens the ability of U.S. colleges and universities to attract top talent, diminishing our global competitiveness." President Trump attempted to introduce this same rule near the end of his first term, but it was withdrawn a year later by the Biden administration. Now, this announcement comes on the heels of Trump also saying he wants to allow 600,000 Chinese students into American universities. So I am against this new rule, which is perhaps no surprise. But aside from my own status as an immigrant, I was never, I should say, a full-time student here. I was too old for that. But this actually goes to, I think, a bigger question, which we have discussed on Rising this week in relation to the Chinese students. I consider it useful and important for the United States to attract the most gifted people it can, the most highly educated people it can, and to harness that intelligence and potential entrepreneurship or scientific knowledge or whatever it should happen to be for the good of the US. And I think everyone is in a global competition for this kind of talent. Highly educated people are much less likely overall to be a drain on the system in any kind of dependency kind of fashion. And so I am broadly against this rule and supportive of the US acquiring as many foreign students as it reasonably can.
Yeah, I have sort of mixed feelings about this because I do agree that if we are going to have immigration in the United States, then the proper way to do it would be a meritocracy, bringing in the best and the brightest in ways that can boost the American economy while also perhaps bringing innovation, building companies, entrepreneurship, things like that. I also have concerns just because when I was doing some research last year about STEM degrees and particularly coding, because I was sparked by a stupid X thread about the whole Learn to Code fiasco, which I'm sure everyone remembers.
Sure.
And I was going through these computer science and other STEM graduates who are American citizens and found out that a lot of them are underemployed. A significant amount are not even working in the industry that they study to go to school for, and a large part of that is because of H-1B visa holders. Now, that's not necessarily a direct overlap with the people that we're talking about here on student visas, but presumably some people come and get educated in the U.S. and maybe go home and get an H-1B, although I think these people are more likely to get green cards. But all of that is being to be said is that when you do focus on highly skilled immigration, you also have to consider potential crowding out of Americans who are also paying a lot of money to get these college degrees. And I do know a few people who went through college and basically just kept getting professional degrees because they knew it would allow them to stay in the United States. So there is some abuse of the process. I don't know what percentage of the people who are on these student visas are abusing it.
Well, I can try and help you with that, Amber, because in this proposed order, they talked about the fact that there are 2,100 people who entered the United States with this kind of student visa between 2000 and 2010. Who are still here on active F visa status. In other words, these people are claiming that they have remained in full-time education for a minimum of 15, to 20 years, which is quite a long time. Now, against that, what there are apparently, or last year there were 1.1 million foreign students in total on these visas, and 215,000 of them were pursuing doctorates. So, obviously pretty advanced educational levels. On the H-1B visa question, I think more sympathy for the case you're making there, because one of the problems I have, I guess, from a somewhat left-leaning perspective is the H-1B visa tethers the visa holder in quite a close way to the employer.
That's right.
And if they lose that job, they are at risk of having to leave the country. Therefore, to my mind, it gives the employer too much leverage, and a leverage that he or she would not have over a native-born American employee. Right. And I do think that that's a valid point for sure.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I think one of the other things that the Trump administration could potentially look at in terms of making sure that students who do come to the U.S. to get educated and take advantage of our university system don't just go home and take that and lead to brain drain, is potentially to tax remittances, which is money that they send back to their home country. It's something that the U.S. has looked at with Canada and Mexico as of late because of the illegal immigration crisis as well. And a lot of other countries do tax remittances as a way to keep the income that's being generated in their country within the country. So potentially one area just to look at to make sure that there's some incentive for the best and brightest to stay here after they get educated here. But I separately have a lot of concern about the Chinese students. The White House did clarify, saying that it's $300,000 for each year for 2 years, which is an extension of the current policy while they negotiate this trade deal with China. Now, of course, I would want to know, well, what are we giving up or what are we getting in exchange for allowing 300,000 Chinese students a year, some of whom could be co-opted by the CCP. The rest of them will certainly be spied on. What is the trade? What is the trade arrangement there? Are we getting enough for offering China basically a open door to our university system?
Well, people who are on the student visa anyway are screened, to my understanding. The other thing is when people, I mean, obviously the CCP is the CCP. I'm not defending that element of it. But we are, you say, what are we getting? Well, we are potentially getting the intelligence and skills and talents of those people if we can hold on to them beyond the period of their education. So I don't think there's a reason to differentiate out. I mean, the principle still remains that it is to the United States' advantage to have the smartest and best educated people it can here rather than elsewhere.
But there is a much higher risk when we're talking about Chinese students because of the CCP spycraft. And we know from reports that there have been numerous instances of research secrets, lab materials being stolen and sent back to China from Chinese-born individuals and even Americans who have been assisting them. And I was listening to a panel this past weekend from some higher education experts, and one of them pointed out that when a Chinese student who is not loyal to the CCP comes to the U.S. to study, they often look at the class rosters of the classes that they sign up for to make sure that there are no other Chinese students in there, because they know almost certainly that that's a CCP spy. So those are really the lengths that they go to, and I think we just can't underestimate how dangerous it could potentially be to just open the floodgates.
I'm sure it's a topic we'll return to again in the near future. Meanwhile, Alligator Alcatraz, the detention facility in Florida, has been ordered to shut down. We'll be right back with more details on that. So-called Alligator Alcatraz looks to be shutting down soon. U.S. District Judge Kathleen Williams ruled last week that the Immigration Detention Center in the Florida Everglades must close operations by late October. Late Wednesday, Williams denied a request to pause her order. The 2-month-old facility has drawn fierce criticism from the left for its allegedly unsanitary conditions, including reports of non-flushing toilets, unsafe food, and insect infestation. There have also been complaints about little access for detainees to the legal system. But that being said, a federal judge in Miami dismissed a related lawsuit earlier this month after finding that detainees did, in fact, receive access to legal counsel.
Department of Homeland Security balked at the decision, saying that the closure will disrupt the administration's immigration enforcement goals. Border Czar Tom Homan slammed the decision Thursday. Take a look.
I don't understand the judge's ruling. I think it's a radical decision. I think it's really about anti-immigration enforcement rather than the conditions of the facility. I was there. Look, it's a transition facility. It's not a long-term facility.
Florida Governor Ron DeSantis is going forward with plans for another immigration detention center dubbed Deportation Depot. It will be at a state prison. Although Deportation Depot doesn't have quite the same ring as Alligator Alcatraz, Niall.
No, they like their alliteration there, obviously.
Speedway Slammer.
I don't know. I mean,
Cornhusker Clink.
I mean, I don't want to seem too dour about these things, but I actually don't, the nicknaming thing, I think, is a sort of gloating about harsh conditions being imposed on people. If people are in the country illegally and they get caught and they're up for deportation and eligible for deportation, they can be deported, subject, of course, to due process. What I have always disliked about the Alligator Alcatraz thing is the what I consider sort of gratuitous cruelty of it, or, Trump, of course, when he toured it, said something, I can't remember the exact quotes, but it was how you should basically run to avoid an alligator or to get caught or whatever. And I was just like, these are people who have broken immigration law in pursuit of a better life, they have got caught, they're presumably going to be deported. That's why they're there in the detention facility. Okay, but like this sort of, as I say, sort of gratuitous cruelty about it, I don't particularly care for.
I view it more as gloating about the fact that illegals are getting removed in the first place, as opposed to the supposedly harsh conditions, a lot of which has been unconfirmed. But is that? And I assume that's why the judge ordered the closure of the facility, or was it a separate reason?
We should perhaps have made that a bit clearer, because as I understand it, and people can, or producers or our audience can correct me if I'm wrong, the actual reason for the closure is to do with the contention that environmental reviews, which are mandatory, were skipped past in opening this facility, and that, I'm sure this argument would particularly appeal to you, but that the delicate ecosystem of the Florida Everglades was being disrupted by having this facility there. There is, as I understand it, isn't there an airstrip close to it, or the site of an airstrip?
The area had already been basically paved over, so it's kind of silly, but...
Well, the judge disagrees with you, Albert, so you can take your case to her.
I'm sure a lot of judges disagree with me, but that's okay. I just remember there was the Washington Post article that detailed some of the complaints from detainees in Alligator Alcatraz, and one of their complaints was that there were a lot of mosquitoes, and it's like, well, no duh, it's Florida. I mean, there's mosquitoes everywhere. I come back with swollen ankles every time I go to Florida.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
You're particularly susceptible to mosquito bites?
I am. I have what they call skeeter syndrome.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it gets swollen and it's disgusting.
Oh,
but not enough about me.
Fair enough.
One of the other complaints was that the food they were offered included cold ham sandwiches.
Oh, I remember you objected.
Yeah, I'm still mad about that. I'm going to lodge that complaint again.
Okay.
What other kind of ham sandwich is there?
Okay.
It's a cold cut. We love them in America.
Fair enough. I mean, look, there's some complaints like that. I take your point on. What is also worth noting, though, is that there were much more serious allegations than that about, like, basically raw sewage on the floor, and about toilets that didn't flush, and about the issue of legal access is contested. It seems to be, the judge ruling against on that basis. But I mean, there has to be a baseline, just as there is in or should be in prisons or jails for people convicted of criminal offences. There has to be a baseline of adequate treatment. Nobody need be, put up in a hotel, to use the sort of language of conservatives in this. There does need to be a basic level of sanitation if you're detaining people somewhere.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And look, if there were complaints, it sounds like most of them were resolved, or at least DHS claims that they tried to resolve them. When they saw flooding, for example, outside of the temporary tent, they made sure that they secured it down. I would be interested to see if there was a difference in the conditions when the facility first opened versus what it looks like now. But I also think generally the American people, just based on the latest immigration polls, are probably not super fussed about the conditions in a detention camp for migrants, to be frank. I think a lot of them are going to say, you know what, if you don't want to end up there, then you can self-deport, get your $1,000 check, or don't come to the country illegally.
I think that it is self-evidently true that immigration was Trump's strongest issue last year. And still is. And it is, I think, clearly evident that a lot of people have a lot of concerns about it. And, it had always seemed, it's one of the issues where I am not as far to the left as some of the Democratic Party are, because I had always felt that there, and for that matter, some in the media are, because even before Trump came back to power, one would often see these reports about an individual who was in the country illegally and was going to be deported. And the argument at its base was often that that's inconvenient for that person, right? That they had built a life here and that therefore they should be allowed to stay. That's a hard case to make. To me, honestly, if someone is in the country illegally and gets caught for that, then there have to be kind of consequences for that. Now, there are things to be considered when relating to when people who are illegal in the country have young children, for example. What happens to them? I do think that the Dreamers are a completely different category, because as a general matter, in any issue of law, we don't generally consider minors who have been dragged into an activity by their parents to be culpable for those activities. And so I think that the Dreamers are a completely different question. So if you're caught in the country illegally and you have to leave, you have due process rights, and those rights should be exercised, but there are consequences to it. So I take your point in general terms. I get back to the fact that I think it is, I do think it's gloating, honestly, the Alligator Alcatraz deportation depot stuff, or, you know, the photographing of the people who were deported to El Salvador and Kristi Noem and her photo opportunity there. That stuff I don't like, but anyway, you know, I take your point about the popular opinion on the issue.
Yeah, and moving on to actually one of my favorite topics that we're going to talk about. Trump is looking to make D.C. beautiful again. And it's not about the crime issue. This is actually different. How a new executive order mandates a certain look for all federal buildings. We'll be right back after this on Rising.
President Trump is looking to make our nation's capital beautiful again. In a new executive order, Trump is mandating all federal buildings, quote, embrace classical architecture, making that the default style for all federal DC buildings. The White House releasing this statement. In the District of Columbia, classical architecture shall be the preferred and default architecture for federal public buildings, absent exceptional factors necessitating another kind of architecture.
The order takes aim at other designs, including the brutalist style, which you can see here with the lovely, beautiful FBI headquarters. The president does not typically have input on architectural decisions, but this is not new for President Trump, who has already made changes to the White House, including paving over grass in the Rose Garden and adding yellow striped umbrella seating. He also installed 2 giant flagpoles waving American flags, and next month he will start construction on a $200 million ballroom. So lots of changes coming to the district in a lot of different ways.
For sure.
I, for one, am a huge fan of this executive order. Mm-hmm. It's like fairly apolitical. This was something he actually did at the end of his first term alongside the statue garden with the American heroes, which were quickly, of course, undone by the Biden administration. But if you've ever been to the FBI building, if you've ever been to the State Department, I know you have, Niall, they're just so crushingly ugly. I mean, it's called brutalist for a reason. Yeah. And when we had the Capitol right outside of our beautiful studio here, and it's just magnificent. It really takes your breath away to see these things in person, and I think it is well worth it to have some guidelines on what our taxpayer-funded government buildings look like. They should be the best of the best.
Highly unusual for me to praise a Trump executive order, but I will have to make an exception in this case, I think, because you are right about some of those brutalist designs. We were talking before the show about our experiences of some of those places. Every time I go in or past the State Department, I live quite close to it, the ugliness of that building just appalls me. And I'm not some like big architect, like I know very little about the history of architecture and telling this period from that period. I just think it's a kind of dismal building. The FBI building is a fraction better perhaps, but it's pretty marginal. And you know, it is something that I have thought about generally, not just in terms of DC, where I go to New York quite often. You go to something like Grand Central Station, and it is this beautiful building, which of course serves a very important purpose as well, but is designed with real aesthetic taste and grandeur. And it has seemed to me at times that we've basically stopped doing that. I mean, Moynihan Train Hall's better than Penn Station, but it's not Grand Central either, you know? So if there were more of that, or you mentioned the Capitol, the Library of Congress, the Supreme Court. I mean, there are lots of beautiful buildings here, and I think aspiring to that kind of style is a good thing. Yeah,
it seems like we used to put so much thought and effort into designing these buildings, and now it's, well, let's just throw up a box and try to save as much money as possible. Exactly. But you're not even really saving money because, I mean, if the new Fed headquarters is what, like $2 billion? It doesn't really matter. So let's throw a few arches on there. Let's have some columns. Let's make it look pretty. I said this actually, I think, shortly after I started co-hosting this show, and I'm going to say it again because I think it's real, and I got made fun of at the time, but I don't care.
Oh, no.
I think that beautiful architecture actually inspires a higher level of thinking. When you surround yourself with aesthetically pleasing things, I think you are going to have a better life. You're going to have more high-ordered thoughts, and I do think that those two things really are connected.
Yeah, I mean, I would not make fun of you for that
Thank
view
you.
at all. I think that our surroundings do generally affect us, and I think if are things designed with taste and as I say, some sense of grandeur, I think that's better. I also think, just to get back to your point about, you know, actually aspiring to these higher levels of things, so often I think in modern life we experience things that are just made as cheaply as possible and as kind of tattily as possible to serve their purpose for the minimum cost.
Yes.
And that, in fact, that's just not very inspiring to anyone, whether it's a car or a computer or a building. And if things have more thought put into them, I think it sort of is a virtuous circle.
I mean, think about the comparison of old typewriters
Right.
compared to what our laptops look like now.
Right.
You cannot tell me that someone sitting down to write at that laptop
Sure.
was not going to turn out better content just by the nature of their surroundings than the person who clicks away on the keyboard.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think we should return to quill and parchment.
Hey, let's do it.
And see how that works. But, you know, in general, environment matters, including the aesthetics of the environment. And if the aesthetics of DC are going to be improved here, which I don't think they were in the Rose Garden, let me get one anti-Trump point in there.
The only thing I agree, it doesn't look great. The only thing I like about it is that when you would go to the Rose Garden with heels on to cover an event, say goodbye to your shoes. Game over.
An experience that men generally never have. I certainly have never had, but it's a fair point. That harmonious note does it for us on Rising Live. Look out for more exclusive YouTube content coming your way today. And be sure to like, share and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we are now available anywhere you listen to podcasts. We'll see you next week. Happy Labor Day.